The first time they handed me a belt instead of an apology, I was 9 years old. That moment carved something deep into my spine, a lesson that in this house being a girl meant being invisible until needed and disposable when used up. I didn't grow up in a home. I grew up in a system, a quiet, polished system where my brother was the prince, and I was the unpaid maid who smiled through bruises. But this isn't a story about pain. It's about precision. It's about how silence became my sharpest revenge. And by the time they realized I was gone, all they had left was the sound of their own voices echoing through empty rooms. Before I take you through everything, I want to ask, where are you watching this from? And how old are you? Don't forget to subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories for more powerful soul-deep stories like this one. They didn't raise a daughter. They trained a servant. I was 9 the first time my father reached for the belt because I didn't clean my brother's shoes on time. Not his shoes, not even mine. Just shoes left in the hallway like a trap waiting to prove I hadn't earned my keep. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The belt looped through his fingers like a practiced dance. I remember the sting, but more than that, I remember the silence afterward. That moment changed everything. No apology, no explanation. Just a look from my mother that said, "You should have known better." From that day on, I understood love in my house had rules. And girls didn't get the handbook. My brother Evan could break things, lie, skip chores, and be met with chuckles. One time he smashed a vase playing with a ball inside the house, something I'd be punished just for watching. But instead of blame, I got a lecture. If you'd vacuumed like you were supposed to, he wouldn't have slipped. I was punished for the air, for the possibility. And when I dared to ask why, my father's answer was always the same: because he's a boy. You'll understand when you're older. Well, I'm older now. And I understand it wasn't about gender. It was about power, control. A hierarchy where I was at the bottom and Evan didn't even have to try. Every morning I woke up earlier than everyone else. Made breakfast, folded laundry, packed his lunch, and then mine if there was time. I wasn't a daughter. I was the quiet engine keeping their day running. When I once asked my mother why Evan didn't have to do anything, she just said, "It builds character." And when I asked why his didn't need building, she looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. The answer was in her silence, in the way she turned away. It wasn't that Evan didn't need character. It was that I didn't need freedom. At least not in their eyes. But you know what stays with me the most? Not the chores. Not even the beatings. It was the language. The small phrases that built a cage I didn't see until I started pushing against it. Don't talk back. Be useful. You'll make a good housewife if nothing else. I heard be useful more than I ever heard my name. And in time I started believing that usefulness was my only value. That if I wasn't scrubbing, folding, cooking, I didn't belong. I wasn't needed for who I was, only for what I could do. And I wonder, have you ever lived like that? Have you ever been someone else's convenience? Their background noise, their function, not their family? I don't remember the last time Evan did the dishes. I'm not even sure he knew where the dish soap was kept. He had his own bathroom with a towel I wasn't allowed to touch. Meanwhile, I scrubbed both toilets, his and mine. And when I asked why it wasn't shared responsibility, I got a look from my mother that froze me. "That's not your place to question," she said. "You're the girl. That's what girls do." It wasn't just about housework. It was about my place in the world. They built one where my labor was expected, but my voice wasn't welcome. In that house, obedience was currency. And I was always in debt. They praised me at church. "She's so responsible. So mature for her age." People would nod, smile, say how lucky my parents were. And I'd stand there holding my brother's coat, wondering if anyone would notice I hadn't spoken a word. Being mature, I learned, meant being silent. Smiling when I wanted to cry. Serving when I wanted to run. Evan, on the other hand, was chaos in sneakers. He left messes wherever he went, and I was expected to follow behind with a rag. "It's good practice for when you're a wife," my mother once joked, tossing me a dirty plate from across the table. I was 12. There were no birthdays in our house for me. Not really. I got a cheap card usually signed with something like "Be useful this year," but Evan got cakes, balloons, photos. One year they gave me a necklace that said, "To remind you, we didn't have to keep you." I still don't know if it was a joke. I didn't laugh. I just said thank you because that was expected too. I'd be lying if I said I never questioned whether I was adopted or a mistake or some forgotten obligation. But deep down I knew the truth. They didn't see me as a child. They saw me as an investment, something that returned value only when in use. And I know how that sounds. Harsh, cold, like I'm bitter. But let me ask you, what would you call it if every time you cried someone asked you to cry quieter? If every time you broke down someone reminded you there were still chores left to do? Sometimes I wonder if they even saw me at all. Not the grades I brought home, not the folded shirts, not the steaming meals. Me, the girl underneath it all. The one who stayed up at night memorizing the grocery list, knowing exactly how much bleach went in each load of whites who ironed uniforms she wasn't allowed to wear herself. I was efficient. I was quiet. And to them that made me perfect. But I wasn't perfect. I was vanishing. Slowly. And they didn't notice. Or maybe they did and preferred it that way. It was a Sunday morning when the gears finally jammed. I had just finished ironing Evan's clothes for a party I wasn't invited to. The steam from the iron had soaked my shirt, and I could feel the fabric clinging to my back. As I walked into the kitchen, Evan sat at the table gulping down the last glass of orange juice like he owned the air in the room. "Did you save any for me?" I asked, not accusing, not angry, just tired. He looked at me and smirked. "You're lucky I don't make you peel the oranges too." And that's when something inside me broke. Not loudly, not even with heat. I just said it. "Peel them yourself." The room went silent. Not the calm kind. The kind right before the sky cracks open. My mother turned from the sink like she'd heard a foreign language spoken. "What did you just say?" she asked slowly, dragging each word as if it were a threat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream. I just repeated it. "I'm done. I'm not doing his chores anymore. I'm not his maid." That's when the sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs. My father. He didn't ask what happened, didn't stop to question. He just headed straight for the drawer. We all knew which one. The one with the belts. He pulled it open like it was muscle memory, like it wasn't even a decision. Just instinct. I backed away, but not in fear, just in resignation. He held the belt in his hand, letting it loop and curl as he stepped toward me. "You've forgotten your place," he said, his voice low but sharp. "And I'm going to help you remember." My mother didn't stop him. Evan didn't flinch. He smiled like it was a sitcom, and I was the punchline. And I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't run. I stood there, because something inside me had finally calcified. When that leather cracked against my side, it burned. God, it burned. But for the first time, the pain didn't feel like punishment. It felt like proof. Proof that I wasn't going to be part of this machine anymore. I didn't sob. I didn't fold. I just breathed through it like someone learning how to walk through fire. Later that night, I packed a sleeping bag, a change of clothes, and 3 crumpled dollar bills I'd been saving without purpose. My rib throbbed with every movement, but I didn't stop. I didn't leave a note. I didn't take anything that belonged to them. Not the necklace. Not the family photo where I was half-cropped at the edge. Not even the toothbrush I'd been forced to share with a cousin to save space. I took my silence, my breath, my decision, and I walked out. Let me ask you something. If you'd been told your whole life that you were worthless, unless you obeyed, how long would it take before you started believing it? And more importantly, how long would it take before you decided that belief no longer served you? I didn't know where I was going that night. Just that I wasn't going back. The streets were cold and each step made my sides scream, but that pain felt cleaner than the silence I used to live in. I ended up outside Laya's house, my only friend, whose kindness wasn't conditional. Her parents weren't saints, but when they saw me standing there in the dark with a busted rib and no shoes on, they didn't ask questions. They didn't shame me. Her mom wrapped me in a blanket, handed me a cup of soup, and said, "You can stay in the basement until we figure it out." And that was the first time in 17 years someone said we, and meant me too. They cleared out the boxes in the storage room, laid a mattress on the floor, and gave me space. Not just a physical one, but emotional space where I could breathe without permission. I spent the first week flinching at sudden noises, half expecting to be called useless or handed a chore list. But no one did. I wasn't expected to earn my keep with labor. I was just allowed to exist. I didn't know how to handle it at first. I'd sit up at night clutching my knees, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door that never came. Healing is slow, especially when the wounds are not just under your skin, but deep in your understanding of self-worth. My back was scabbed. My breathing still caught in my chest when I bent too far. But what really hurt, what throbbed in the silence, was the absence of a voice I still somehow expected to hear. I thought they'd call. I didn't expect love, but maybe a threat, a scream, a demand to come home. Something. Instead, nothing. They didn't even ask if I was alive. And that's when the real wound opened. Not the cracked rib, not the belt bruise, but the realization that to them I was never really a person. I was a system, a role, a function. And once I stopped performing, they simply removed me from the picture. Like I'd been dust on their floor all along, easy to sweep away. And I ask you now, what cuts deeper, the pain of a beating, or the moment you realize you were never even worth being missed? That silence wasn't peace. It was punishment. Their silence told me I was right to leave, that I wasn't crazy, that everything I suspected about their love being conditional wasn't just suspicion, it was fact. So I did something small, quiet, just for me. I started writing it all down. Not for revenge, not for a book, but because I needed to remember. Every dish I cleaned, every uniform I ironed, every time I scrubbed puke off Evan's carpet after parties I wasn't allowed to attend. Not as a list of grievances, but as proof I existed. That I was there. That I mattered, even if they refused to say it out loud. By the third week, the silence from them was no longer shocking. It had settled into something colder: confirmation. No calls. No texts. No messages to ask if I was safe, hungry, alive. Until one day a message finally landed in my inbox. It was from my mother. Short. Blunt. "Evan has an awards dinner and none of his suits are ironed. You need to come home and stop being ridiculous. No, how are you? No, are you okay?" Just an order, like I'd been on an extended break instead of escaping a house that left bruises deeper than skin. I stared at the message and I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. They hadn't changed. They were just missing their worker. I didn't reply. But I kept the message. Not for court. Not for drama. Just for me. A receipt for the life I used to live. A few days later, another message came. This time from my father. "This is childish. No one in the real world will tolerate your attitude. Come home and apologize and we'll let you earn your place again." Let me. Like my existence needed to be permitted. Like my value still hinged on obedience. I read it twice. Not to question it, but to remember why I left. Because in that house, love had always been a transaction. One I was done paying into. I showed the texts to Laya. She didn't say anything right away. Just looked at me and shook her head. Her mom offered to block their numbers, but I said no. I didn't need silence enforced. I just needed it to stay honest. By then I'd moved from the basement into their cleared-out storage room. They gave me a real bed, a dresser, a small desk. I had nothing of value, no inheritance, no savings. but I had a door that locked and people who looked me in the eye when they spoke. And I was more whole in that tiny room than I'd ever been in a house 3 times the size. That's when I started making the list. Not for revenge, for recognition. A complete inventory of everything I had done since I was 10. Chores, emotional labor, the weight of silence. I wrote down the meals I cooked, the laundry. I folded the reminders I gave my mom when her own mind was too busy with judgment. It wasn't just a list. It was a ledger, a testament, a personal archive of all the invisible effort that had kept their worlds spinning while mine was collapsing. I didn't want to forget it. I wanted to reclaim it, because every unchecked box on that list was proof I wasn't worthless. I had been indispensable. They just didn't want to admit it. And that's when the shift happened. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want them to see how well I was doing. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation or a viral post. I just needed to live in a way that made their absence irrelevant. And slowly it started working. Not because they hurt, but because I stopped. Stopped begging. Stopped folding. Stopped shrinking. I wasn't their servant anymore. I was mine. And that was the beginning of something they could never undo. If I was nothing to them, then that's exactly what I'd leave them with: nothing. Not a scandal, not a scream, not even a handwritten note begging to be heard. Just absence sharpened into a weapon. I wasn't out for revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't want headlines. I didn't want sympathy. What I wanted, what I needed, was for them to feel the weight of what I used to give. Not in words, in routine, in silence, in every space I once filled that now sat empty and unmanageable. They were so used to my presence, my quiet obedience, my predictability. The moment it was gone, they weren't just inconvenienced, they were exposed. The first whisper of it came from a neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, while I was helping Laya's mom trim the hedges. She squinted at me like she wasn't sure if I was a ghost or a memory. "Your mama okay?" she asked, like concern had finally seeped through the cracks of their lies. "Saw her last week struggling with groceries. Said Evan's got too much on his plate to help." I nodded. Politely, "Guess she'll manage." But inside, I knew. The cracks were spreading. My mother, once the queen of control, was now drowning in the very system she forced on me. My absence had turned their home into a maze of unmet needs. Mrs. Dorsey kept talking. That's how I learned Evan had been late to school for 2 weeks straight. My father had shown up at work in wrinkled shirts, no undershirt collar creased wrong. And the most delicious detail, my mother had quietly requested meal assistance from the church, lying and saying she'd injured her back. She didn't mention me. Of course not. She couldn't admit that I was the missing piece, that the engine she'd run into the ground had finally walked off. But it wasn't just their pride unraveling, it was their entire rhythm. The schedule I once kept with invisible precision was breaking down without a single raised voice from me. I hadn't sent threats. I hadn't written accusations. I'd simply vanished. And it was louder than any belt ever cracked. Because when someone's power depends on your submission, the greatest rebellion is to stop submitting. Not loudly. Just stop. Let me ask you this: have you ever walked away so quietly that the people who abused you didn't even realize they'd been left behind until their lives began to fall apart, without your silent labor holding it all together? I didn't dance on their downfall. I didn't gloat. But I won't lie, I did feel it. That echo, that shift. The way their lives began to mirror mine, but without the tools to manage it. They'd trained me to be indispensable. And now, without me, they were drowning in the very tasks they used to toss at me like scraps. And I was finally breathing. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that doesn't need noise. It's the kind that grows in the quiet, in the stillness, where you're no longer reacting, just observing. That's where I lived. Not in bitterness, but in a steady kind of peace that came from knowing I was no longer a part of their story. And yet without me, their story started crumbling. I didn't have to lift a finger. Life did it for me. Evan's spotless uniforms started fading. My father, once the picture of pressed authority, became the man with coffee stains on his shirt. And my mother, she stopped being sharp. She became slow, distracted, tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from age but from loss of control. They couldn't tell the truth. That would have required humility. So they rewrote the story, told neighbors and church members that I had left early for school, that I was pursuing life experience. I wasn't surprised. Pride doesn't like confession. It likes convenience. And painting me as ambitious was easier than admitting they had raised a daughter so tightly wound she broke herself just to be free. But lies have weight. And without the foundation of my silent labor, their home started to rot beneath the surface. The routines they never noticed, I maintained the groceries, the laundry cycles, the reminders, the appointments began to unravel. The more they lied to others, the more reality laughed behind their backs. Laya's cousin, who lived 2 streets over, started giving me updates. Not because I asked, because she thought I should know. "Your mom was in the yard today trying to fix the garden by herself," she said once. She looked tired. Another time, Evan dragged a trash bag full of laundry to the laundromat. Looked pissed. I never asked for more. I didn't need details. The images were enough. The weight of their lives was finally resting on their own shoulders, and they were buckling under it. I didn't want them to suffer for drama's sake. I wanted them to live inside the reality they built, the one where I never mattered unless I served. So I gave them exactly that. No response, no argument, no return. Just the absence of the girl who used to be everywhere at once. The one who remembered every appointment, who folded every towel the way Mom liked, who knew Evan's favorite snacks and stocked them before he noticed they were missing. They lost all that. Not through vengeance, but through neglect their own. Let me ask you, have you ever realized that your silence caused more disruption than your words ever could? That your leaving made a bigger dent than any confrontation you could stage? That's what I was becoming. Not a rebel, not a runaway, but a ripple. A quiet shift that dismantled everything they thought would keep spinning without me. And as much as they might have tried to pretend otherwise, the truth was clear: they didn't miss me. They missed what I did. And without it, they weren't just lost. They were undone. The funny thing about being invisible for so long is that when you finally step out of the frame, people still stare at the empty space you left, like it's supposed to fill itself. My parents didn't just lose a daughter, they lost infrastructure. I wasn't just the girl who cooked and cleaned. I was the system. I kept the rhythm, the peace, the order. And when I stopped, they didn't know how to move without the beat. The machine jammed, then groaned, and then started to collapse, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding failure that only they could hear echoing in the silence. I didn't need to witness it in person. I could feel it. Like the way you can tell someone's watching you, even when you're alone. There's a certain weight to absence when people have to face what you used to carry for them. That's what they were feeling now. My father's temper, once sharp and quick, reportedly turned sluggish and irritable. He'd show up late to work, confused and frustrated. My mother, so used to control, began missing appointments, forgetting things she used to pride herself on. And Evan. He had no idea how to function in a world where someone wasn't 2 steps ahead of him, making sure he never had to lift a finger. But here's the part that stayed with me most. They didn't even try to reach out for the right reasons. No apologies, no concern. Only need, only utility. And when I didn't respond, they didn't shift toward reflection. They shifted toward resentment. That's when I knew. I hadn't just left them. I had broken them in a way they didn't know how to fix. Because they hadn't built themselves around love. They had built themselves around me. Around what I gave. And now, with me gone, there were holes everywhere they turned and no one to patch them. At night, I would sit by the small desk Laya's family gave me and write, not in a journal, but in lists. Not of pain, but of effort. A full inventory of the invisible work I used to perform. Meal prep, scheduling, shopping, ironing, homework help, sick day management. And all the while, I'd wonder how many things had I done for them that they had never even noticed. How many pieces of their lives had run smoothly because of me, only to collapse the second I stepped away. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever walked out of someone's life and realized they weren't mourning you? They were mourning what you did for them, that your humanity was never the loss, only your labor. I started to realize that my absence wasn't just a punishment, it was education. They were finally learning what it cost to live the way they expected me to. And no lecture, no belt, no command could teach them what my silence was now screaming. Every day I was never the problem. I was the glue. And now without me, they were slowly coming apart. I never planned a big gesture. No social media post. No public shaming. No letter left on the kitchen counter with poetic rage. That's not the kind of revenge I wanted. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted erosion, slow, undeniable, permanent. And the best way to achieve that wasn't by exposing them. It was by removing myself completely and letting the truth reveal itself, inch by inch, in their daily struggle. That's the thing about people who depend on your silence, they never expect you to use it against them. So I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but as strategy. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't return calls. I didn't ask mutuals how they were doing. I just lived. Quietly, intentionally. And every day that I didn't show up, didn't bend, didn't crawl back into that house like I had something to prove, was a day the foundation they built on my submission cracked deeper. Evan missed another appointment. My mother burned another dinner. My father wore the same shirt twice and no one ironed it. They weren't just struggling, they were unraveling. And all I had to do was nothing. The day I sealed the box was the day I understood the true weight of absence. It wasn't a box of memories, it was a reckoning. I filled it with everything they'd tossed at me like tokens of control. Birthday cards signed with passive-aggressive digs. The locket my mother gave me, the one she said was to remind me I wasn't an obligation. The chore lists with my name printed in bold ink taped to the fridge like scripture. I folded each item with care, not out of sentiment, but out of clarity. This wasn't nostalgia. This was closure. I dropped it on their porch without a note. I didn't knock. Didn't wait. Just turned and walked away. Because that box said everything they never let me say. I remember. I was there. I mattered. And now I'm gone. Let me ask you if you could put your pain in a box and hand it back to the people who caused it. Would you? Not to hurt them, but to return what was never yours to carry. They never replied. They didn't have to. I knew they'd opened it. I knew they'd read each piece like a mirror they couldn't turn away from. And from that day forward, the messages stopped. The accusations quieted. The manipulations went cold. Because they finally understood silence wasn't absence, it was punishment. And it was just beginning. Their house, once so loud with demands and commands, had grown still. No more barking orders. No more slammed doors. Just echoes. The kind that follow you through a hallway when there's no one left to blame. And as far as I was concerned, that was the only sound they deserved to hear. They weren't used to stillness. They were used to reaction. Used to my crying, my scrambling, my endless efforts to win back a hint of warmth from people who only knew how to measure love and obedience. Without me, the air in that house changed. The silence was no longer mine. It was theirs. And unlike me, they didn't know how to live inside it. They flailed, they stalled, they blamed each other. Because when the person they always leaned on disappears, suddenly everyone has to carry their own weight, and none of them were built for that. Laya's cousin passed by their house on her way to work every morning and began to mention things in passing casually like she was updating a weather report. Your mom was in the garden again. Looked like she didn't know what she was doing. Another day, Evan was dragging 2 garbage bags of laundry. Didn't even fold it, just crammed it into his car. And one time, she hesitated. Your dad, he's walking with a cane now. I think he fell. I nodded. No surprise. No panic. Just a quiet confirmation that the world they once ruled was shrinking around them. I didn't feel glee. That's what people don't understand about this kind of revenge. It's not about dancing on graves. It's about the power of not returning, of letting them sit with the damage they caused. I kept folding flyers for my nursing program while she spoke. I never asked for more details. I didn't need them. Their pain didn't need to be described to matter. It just needed to exist. Quietly, like mine had for years. And then came the news that stopped me cold. My grandmother passed away. Not the cruel one, this was my father's mother. The only person in that family who ever looked me in the eyes and said, "You deserve better." She didn't protect me. She didn't intervene. But she saw me. And sometimes being seen is the first crack in a wall built of silence. The funeral was small, respectful, a closed casket in a church that smelled like cedar and dust. When I walked in, heads turned. Whispers began to rise like smoke. My mother stiffened her eyes wide. My father looked as if he'd aged decades, the belt that once hung from his hip, now replaced by the weight of every bruise he couldn't erase. But they didn't speak. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know how. That was the shift. That was the new silence. Not mine. Theirs. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched? The people who once silenced you realize they've lost the language to reach you, that your absence taught them a new kind of quiet one they can't control. After the service, I stood outside holding the folded program. The sun was warm, the breeze steady. I wasn't grieving the way they expected. I wasn't angry. I was complete. Their world had cracked and mine had opened. And for once, I didn't owe anyone a single word. Grief has a way of peeling the noise off people. At my grandmother's funeral, it wasn't the hymns or the quiet sobs that filled the room. It was the tension. That brittle, suffocating tension that clings to skin like humidity. I didn't come to make a scene. I didn't come to say goodbye, not really. I came because she was the only one in that family who'd ever looked at me like I mattered. She hadn't protected me, no, but she had seen me. And in a house where my name was rarely spoken with care, sometimes just being seen was enough to warrant a final farewell. I walked in alone. No makeup, no dramatics, black jeans and a clean shirt. My presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. The room shifted as I entered, like someone had opened a window and the air wasn't sure how to behave anymore. My mother went rigid, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles in her neck twitch. My father didn't say a word. He just stared, his eyes tired, sunken. The man who once raised his voice like a weapon now couldn't even raise his gaze. They looked at me like I was the ghost of everything they'd tried to forget. And maybe I was. A quiet reckoning in human form. I didn't need to say anything. My silence was dressed in black and sitting 3 rows behind them, heavy enough to break pews. After the service, I stepped outside into the sunlight, the memorial program still folded in my hand. I stood alone, letting the breeze touch my skin. No one approached me for a while. Until Abigail did. My cousin. Not Evan's cheerleader. Just someone who'd watched from the sidelines. She didn't hug me. She didn't smile. She just said, "They're falling apart, you know." I nodded. She added, "They're afraid of you." I looked her straight in the eye and replied, "They should be." Let me pause here and ask, have you ever become the very thing someone feared because they finally saw the strength in your silence? Abigail exhaled. "They say you're heartless now, cold, ruthless." I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, but because of the irony. They built me this way. They raised me on discipline and duty, on silence and service, on swallowing pain like pills. I didn't become ruthless. I became immune. I looked back at her and said, "They trained me well." And then she told me something that didn't bring joy, just closure. "They're selling the house." I didn't flinch. My fingers twitched around the edge of the program, but not with longing, just with finality. I didn't want the house. I didn't need it. It had never been a home. It was just a stage I'd been forced to perform on. And now the curtain had finally dropped. That building would no longer echo with my footsteps or my absence. It would echo with theirs. They weren't selling the house for money. That much was clear. Abigail made it sound like a financial decision, but I could see beneath it. They were selling it because they couldn't live in it anymore. Not the way it echoed. Not the way the rooms sagged with reminders. It wasn't a home, it had become a haunted shell. Not haunted by spirits. Haunted by silence. My silence. My absence. Every square foot still held the shape of me. My work, my footsteps, my breath. And now without those things, they were left with walls that whispered what they didn't want to hear. I didn't ask when or where they were moving. I didn't care. That house wasn't my past anymore. It was their punishment. Every chore left undone. Every list that went missing. Every forgotten task that used to happen like magic now lost in the fog of their own confusion. They didn't know how to function without me, and that was the point. They had depended on me so thoroughly, so thoughtlessly, that when I was gone, they couldn't recognize their own reflection in the routines. And now they weren't running from the house. They were fleeing the reality it revealed about who they'd always been. I imagined my mother walking into the kitchen, opening the fridge, realizing nothing had been restocked. Standing there in silence, no one to call for help. I imagined my father trying to fix the leaky faucet I once handled with a quiet towel and a bucket at midnight, too afraid to wake him. I imagined Evan tripping over laundry piles, confused why the world no longer revolved around him. None of this brought me joy. It brought me distance. Clean, necessary distance from a life that once defined me through labor. And what do you do when the people who built their lives on your service can no longer bear the house you held together? Do you mourn them, pity them, or simply let them fall? Let me ask you, what's more haunting, a loud confrontation or the weight of someone's absence filling every corner they used to touch? That house was no longer just a structure. It was a monument to everything they ignored. Every thankless year I spent holding it upright. Every insult layered between "be useful" and "don't talk back." Now it had become too heavy for them to carry. And the irony, they never considered it heavy when it was me doing the lifting. But once the weight became theirs, suddenly, the walls were unbearable. I didn't celebrate. I didn't drive past the place one last time. I let it go. Just as I'd let them go. Because when something rots from the inside painting, the walls won't fix it. You tear it down. You walk away. And that's what they were doing. Not with grace. With defeat. And me, I didn't have to do anything. I had already left. All that remained was the echo, and that echo belonged to them. 3 months later, I graduated. There was no stage, no caps flying, no family clapping from the crowd. Just a small pinning ceremony in a modest hall for the nursing program I had clawed my way through. I wore fresh white scrubs, a clean name tag clipped to my chest. Laya sat in the front row with her mom beside her, both of them grinning like I had just won something far greater than a certificate. And in a way, I had. Because for the first time, I had built something on my own. Not as someone's daughter, not as someone's sister, but as me. Independent, whole, unclaimed. I didn't invite my parents. I didn't invite Evan, not out of spite but out of clarity. They weren't dead, but in my world they were buried deep, and I kept the shovel. They had already grieved the loss of control, though they wouldn't call it that. In their story, I was the one who abandoned them. Ungrateful. Cold. A cautionary tale whispered in church circles and buried beneath casseroles. But in truth, I had finally stepped out of the shadows they pretended were light. Laya took a picture of me afterward right there under a cheap banner that read, "Congratulations, nurses." I kept that photo taped to the inside of my closet door. Not for the memory, but for the proof. That I could become something without being someone's tool. That I could build a life from scratch, even if I started with nothing but bruises and borrowed time. Let me ask you, have you ever rebuilt yourself from ruins so quietly that no one noticed until you were standing tall? In the months that followed, I moved into a small place of my own. Nothing fancy. One bedroom, old floors, a fridge that hummed like a nervous bee. But it was mine. Every fork in the drawer, every towel folded on the shelf, every dollar stretched between rent and groceries, it all belonged to me. And I didn't have to earn my right to it by scrubbing someone else's mess. I'd wake up early, not because I had to, but because I liked the stillness before the world moved. I'd make eggs, water a plant, fold a load of laundry that wasn't 10 piles high. And for once, my life felt like mine. I never changed my phone number, never blocked them. Not out of hope, just indifference. They never used it again anyway. The silence stayed, but this time it didn't sting. It soothed. And occasionally someone from that old neighborhood would send a message thinking I still wanted news. Evan had been fired. Again. My father stopped driving after passing out in a grocery store. My mother joined some online caregiver support group and posted long, aching paragraphs about the burden of ungrateful children. I didn't reply. I didn't react. Because they were living inside the story they had written for me, only now, without me to carry it, the ending was unraveling. And if they felt haunted, it wasn't by me. It was by the truth they refused to speak. People say time heals. I don't think that's true, not always. Time doesn't erase what happened. It just builds a life around it like new growth curling around a scarred tree trunk. That's what I had now, a life. Not perfect, not loud, but mine. Every small thing I did in that apartment felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Washing dishes and knowing they were mine. Cooking a simple meal without someone criticizing how much salt I used. Waking up early for a shift I had chosen in a field I had earned, not because someone demanded it, but because I wanted to help people heal even as I continued healing myself. There were days I thought about them not with longing, but with observation. I wondered what their mornings looked like now. Who remembered to pay the bills? Who scrubbed the baseboards? Who carried the weight I used to hold without thanks? I didn't wish them harm. I didn't want their suffering. I simply no longer offered my strength to prop up a structure that collapsed the moment I stepped away. The irony was sharp, though. For years I was told I wasn't enough. That I had to do more, be more, serve more to earn even the smallest sliver of approval. And yet once I left, their lives shrank. They didn't rise to meet the space I left behind. They just stumbled in it. Because what they never understood was that I had been the scaffolding holding everything up. Not because I wanted power, but because I had no choice. Let me ask you, have you ever been told you were insignificant only to realize you were the one holding everything together? Laya visited often. Sometimes we'd sit in silence, just sharing the room without needing to fill it. Other times she'd bring pastries and stories from her chaotic job, and we'd laugh until our stomachs hurt. Her friendship wasn't flashy, but it was loyal. She never asked me to rehash the past. She never prodded at scars. She just met me where I was, in the present. And for someone like me, who had always been forced to live in service of other people's needs, that was a gift beyond words. Every Friday I took myself out. Just me. A diner, a walk, a new book in a quiet park. No one ordering me around. No one watching to make sure I was being useful. I'd sit with a cup of coffee and breathe in the ordinary. And in those moments I'd feel something stronger than pride. I'd feel peace. Because I hadn't just escaped a house. I had exited a system. And in doing so, I had rewritten what it meant to exist. No more performance. No more punishment disguised as parenting. Just me moving forward. Not loudly, not to prove anything, but to live. And if they ever sat in that old house surrounded by silence wondering where the girl they once commanded had gone, I hoped the answer echoed back louder than words. She didn't disappear, she simply chose herself. I don't want revenge that burns. I want revenge that echoes. And every quiet day I live in peace, that echo grows louder inside their crumbling house. Not because I shout, not because I expose them, but because they can't escape the truth they refused to face when I was still under their roof. They see it in the sink full of dishes that no longer wash themselves, in the piles of laundry that don't magically fold, in the silence after dinner when no one picks up the pieces they leave behind. That silence it used to belong to me. Now it's theirs. And they don't know how to survive it. I think the hardest thing for them isn't that I left. It's that I didn't come back. Not once. Not even to yell. They were prepared for a fight. For tears. For drama. But not for this hollow, unwavering absence. Because people like them who thrive on control don't know what to do when you no longer play the game. When you stop flinching. Stop answering. Stop explaining yourself. Their power collapses not with an explosion, but with a whimper. Years passed. I kept moving forward. I passed my board exams. Took my first nursing job. Got my own insurance. My own health records. My own emergency contact list. And for the first time, not one name on it belonged to them. I built a world they couldn't touch. One where every decision came from me. One where their approval was no longer currency. And that more than anything is what they couldn't stand. That I stopped needing them. That I stopped explaining myself. That I lived without them and did it better. From time to time, I still heard the stories. Evan bounced from job to job. Landlords kicked him out after he trashed more than one apartment. My father started falling asleep in public places. My mother poured herself into online caregiver forums, writing posts that made her sound like a martyr, raising a heartless daughter who walked away without reason. And maybe that's how they sleep at night, telling themselves, I'm cruel, cold, ungrateful. Let them. Because the truth, it's heavier than they're willing to hold. Let me ask you this. Have you ever watched someone rewrite history just to protect themselves from the weight of their own guilt? I was the one who cooked every meal, folded every shirt, smiled through every slap, scrubbed their shame off the bathroom floor. I was the one who carried the house while they stood tall, oblivious. And when I walked away, they didn't just lose a daughter. They lost the structure that kept their lives breathing. I wasn't raised to be loved. I was raised to be used. So I let them rust. They treated me like I was disposable. So I disposed of them. And now, when I water my plants, no one watches to see if I'm doing it right. When I hang my keys by the door, no one asks where I've been. I don't ask for much. Just peace. Just space. Just the right to exist without being weighed down by what someone else thinks I owe them. And that is the kind of echo that never fades. I kept the shovel. Not literally, but symbolically. I was the one who buried them in my life, not out of hate, but necessity. I didn't need a gravestone or eulogy, just distance, emotional, mental, spiritual. They were still alive, still breathing somewhere, still trying to twist the narrative into something they could live with. But in my world, they were buried. Buried beneath the years of unpaid labor, under the dust of expectation. Under the weight of all the times I was told to be useful instead of being loved. And I never looked back. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't have to. They never reached out again. After the funeral, after the box, after the silence, they understood or at least accepted that they had lost access to me. Not because I was cruel, but because I had finally built a boundary they couldn't cross. a boundary made of stillness, of not reacting. And nothing scares people who once controlled you more than realizing their words no longer move you. That their guilt trips no longer land. That their tools of shame and silence now echo back at them. Life went on. My days became simple, honest, grounded. I worked long shifts at the hospital, came home to my small apartment, watered my plants, folded my laundry, cooked my meals. All of it mundane to the outside world, but sacred to me. Because now every task I completed was for me. Not for approval, not to avoid punishment, but out of love, out of dignity, out of reclaiming my time, my effort, my breath. Let me ask you something. Have you ever realized that healing isn't loud? That it doesn't come in declarations or dramatic moments, but in the quiet choice to keep going. One peaceful act at a time. That's what I was doing. Healing. Slowly. Not from one incident, but from a lifetime of being treated like a tool instead of a daughter. And part of that healing was this: I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need them to get it. Because deep down, I already knew they never would. People who only love you when you serve them don't know how to face you when you no longer do. I thought maybe once I'd run into them by accident. At a store, at a gas station, somewhere ordinary. I rehearsed what I might say. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a nod. But it never happened. And honestly, I stopped needing it to. I didn't want to reopen the wound just to prove I'd healed. I wanted to live beyond it, and I was. I had become someone they could no longer reach, not because I was hiding, but because I had grown too far. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was simply done. It didn't surprise me when I heard they were telling people I was ungrateful, that I had run off, that I'd turned my back on family for no reason. My mother especially had taken to online caregiver forums, painting herself as a martyr. Posts about the burden of raising a defiant daughter, about sacrifices parents make that children never appreciate. Some were vague, others were pointed, and all of them were lies. But I didn't correct them. I didn't reply. Because that would mean stepping back into a story I had already walked out of. I knew why they needed to rewrite it. The truth was too heavy. That they'd beaten a child not to teach, but to control. That they'd raised me not with love, but with labor. That they couldn't function without the very person they'd spent years demeaning. That kind of truth doesn't sit well. So they rewrote it into something they could digest. She was always distant. She thought she was better than us. We did our best. But I knew better. And that was enough. Let me ask you, have you ever let someone lie about you because the truth would destroy them more than it ever could you? In a way, it was almost pitiful, watching them twist themselves into victims while I lived quietly, unbothered. Their posts didn't hurt me. They confirmed what I already knew. They weren't seeking understanding, they were seeking pity. Validation. A reason to not confront what they had lost. But here's the truth they couldn't admit. Not even to themselves, I was gone. And life without me was harder than they ever imagined. Not because I was loud, but because I had done everything so quietly, so invisibly, they hadn't realized how much I held up until it all fell apart. There's a saying that some people don't miss you, they miss how you made their life easier. That's what I had been: a buffer, a system, a reliable extension of their comfort. And now they had to face themselves without my shadow to hide in. Evan still struggled to manage anything beyond himself. My father's health continued to decline. My mother clung to digital sympathy like it could replace the warmth she had pushed away. I didn't rejoice in their struggle. I just didn't rescue them from it. Because my job had never been to hold them together. They had decided that. I had simply stopped agreeing. Friday evenings were my favorite. I'd treat myself to a quiet dinner or stroll through the bookstore down the block. Sometimes I'd buy a secondhand novel and leave notes in the margins, not for anyone in particular, just reminders to myself: you survived, You rebuilt. You are free. And each time I wrote those words, I believed them more. They could keep their story. Twist it, parade it, mourn it. But my story, it belonged to me now. No edits, no distortions. Just the truth carried with grace and guarded by silence. And silence, I've learned, doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest shield you can hold. They never saw me. Not really. They saw what I did. The meals that appeared hot and on time. The clothes that hung clean and pressed in closets. The chores finished without complaint. The appointments remembered. The messes erased before they could be noticed. I was a shadow moving around their needs. A ghost in plain sight. And when I stopped moving, stopped erasing, stopped being useful, they didn't see a daughter who had grown distant. They saw a house that stopped working. And they blamed the emptiness on me, not on the way they had filled me with silence for years. I remember once when I was maybe 13, my mom told a friend she's so independent. We hardly have to do anything. At the time, I smiled. I thought it was a compliment. I didn't realize she was actually admitting they'd already stopped parenting me. I had become the parent, the housekeeper, the emotional manager, the quiet fixer who caught every falling piece while they stood in the middle, pretending nothing had ever been broken. And now, they had to live in the truth of that. The truth that I wasn't raised, I was utilized. That I wasn't cherished, I was assigned. That they didn't lose a rebellious daughter, they lost the foundation they had never thanked, never nurtured, never loved without conditions. And it was that truth, not my absence, that made their house feel haunted. Let me ask you something. Have you ever realized too late that the people you depended on were never actually appreciated, only expected? Laya told me once while we were folding laundry together. You don't flinch anymore when someone talks loud. I hadn't noticed, but she was right. Somewhere between leaving that house and rebuilding my own world, the reflexes started to fade. I stopped bracing for impact, stopped shrinking, stopped calculating the emotional weather in every room. I had grown into someone who no longer mistook obedience for peace. I didn't want to be angry forever. That's not living, that's staying frozen in time. And I had thawed. Not overnight, but over hundreds of tiny moments where I chose myself. Where I reminded myself that existing in ease wasn't selfish. It was human. I started buying real shampoo, not the cheapest brand I was always told to share. I started sleeping in on Sundays. I bought myself a pair of earrings I loved just because they sparkled under soft light, and in all of that, I kept my silence. Because it wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the refusal to re-enter their script. My story had a new author now. Me. And my chapters were no longer written in chores and bruises, but in healing, in dignity, in joy that didn't ask permission. They might still tell the world I disappeared. That I abandoned them. That I changed. And maybe I did. I changed into someone who no longer bowed under the weight of someone else's comfort. And that more than anything is the kind of change they never planned for. These days, my life is quiet, but not the kind of silence that once suffocated me. This silence is soft-chosen restorative. It fills my mornings as I sip coffee alone by the window, listening to the city hum beneath me. No one yells my name from another room. No list is taped to my fridge. No one watches to see if I'm being useful. I move through my space like it was built for me. And in many ways, it was. Not by a builder. By me. Every piece of furniture, every framed quote on the wall, every item I own was selected because I wanted it, not because someone told me I had to earn it. When I wake up early now, it's not to get ahead of Evan's mess or to preempt my mother's glare. It's because I like slow mornings. I like hearing my thoughts before the world gets too loud. I fold my laundry 2 loads a week, not 10. I make my bed not to prove anything, just because it brings me peace. I clean my space not because I'm afraid of being scolded, but because it's mine. And I love taking care of what's mine. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you did something simply because it made you feel good, not because someone expected it? I used to believe I had to earn rest. That quiet was a reward you got after exhausting yourself for others. But now I understand rest is not a prize. It's a right. And I've stopped apologizing for claiming it. I light candles when I read. I wear soft clothes that make me feel like I'm wrapped in safety. I no longer rush through meals. I taste them. I savor the way nourishment feels when it's not tied to duty. Every Friday, I take myself out. Sometimes it's a coffee shop. Sometimes a walk by the river. Sometimes a matinee movie where I sit in the back and enjoy being completely alone. Not lonely, alone. There's a difference. Loneliness is being surrounded by people who don't see you. Solitude is choosing yourself even when no one else shows up. And for years, I didn't know that difference. Now I live inside it. I used to dread the sound of keys turning in the lock, never knowing what version of my parents I'd face that day. Now, when I walk into my own place, there's only me. No anger behind the door. No judgment waiting at the table. Just peace. And every inch of that peace is something I fought for, not with fists or screams, but with the decision to never go back. They don't know who I am now, and honestly, they don't deserve to. The version of me they created doesn't exist anymore. She was built to serve. I was born to live. And if they ever wonder where she went, why she never called, never returned, never explained, I hope they understand that some stories don't end with forgiveness. Some end with freedom. Sometimes I wonder if they sit in that house, what's left of it, and listen for the sounds that used to define me. The footsteps before dawn. The clatter of dishes being stacked just right. The rustle of laundry being folded in the next room. Do they miss the girl who never raised her voice but always showed up? The one they didn't see until she was gone? Or do they just miss the convenience? The comfort of having someone else carry the load they refused to acknowledge was ever there. They never apologized. Not once. No letter. No message. No whispered attempt at reconciliation. And that's okay. I don't need words from people who only ever offered commands. Their silence is a kind of confession. Not one they meant to give, but one they can't take back. Because in the end, it wasn't their anger that hurt me the most. It was their indifference. The way they stepped over my exhaustion. The way they weaponized my loyalty. The way they made love conditional and obedience absolute. Let me ask you, have you ever stopped waiting for an apology and realized that peace arrived the moment you did? They raised me like a tool, so I let them rust. They treated me like I was disposable, so I disposed of them. Not in vengeance, in clarity. I didn't need to scream at them. I just needed to stop showing up. And now, years later, their lives are defined by the very thing they once used against me: silence. But this time it doesn't come from power, it comes from absence. And absence, when earned, becomes a legacy. I don't send holiday cards. I don't answer distant relatives fishing for updates. I don't walk down memory lane because there's nothing there for me. Just cracked pavement and burned bridges. And I don't miss them. What I miss, what I mourn, is the version of myself I had to become just to survive them. But even that grief is fading. With every soft morning, every safe night, every moment that belongs to me and only me. They taught me to be useful. I became whole. They trained me to be silent. I turned silence into strength. They tried to erase me. And I wrote myself back in on my own terms. Now, when I fold laundry, it's gentle. When I clean, it's for peace, not proof. When I cook, I taste. And when I rest, I let the quiet hold me, not as a punishment, but as a home. And if someone ever asks why I don't visit, why I never go back, I just say I left with nothing. And that's exactly what I gave back. Some people call it cruel to walk away without looking back. But I call it survival. Because no child should have to earn love through labor. No daughter should be punished for asking to be treated as human. If you're a parent listening to this and you've mistaken obedience for respect or silence for gratitude, please think again. Love doesn't demand servitude. It invites connection. I want to ask, have you ever lived a version of this story? Did you walk away? Or are you still trying to be useful enough to be seen? Tell me in the comments. If this story meant something to you, like it meant everything to me, please like, share, and subscribe. Sometimes the loudest justice is a life lived in quiet freedom. Thank you for listening.